Among the countless ships that have sailed through history, few hold a place as enduring and symbolic as the Victoria. She was not the largest, nor the most heavily armed, nor even the most beautiful vessel of her age. Yet she achieved what no other had before. She completed the first circumnavigation of the globe. When the battered ship limped back into the port of Seville on September 6, 1522, with only 18 survivors aboard, it marked the conclusion of one of the most extraordinary journeys ever undertaken. The voyage had lasted 3 years, crossed uncharted seas, and endured storms, mutinies, hunger, disease, and the death of its commander, Ferdinand Magellan. The Victoria's return was not merely the story of a ship's survival. It was the story of human endurance, curiosity, and ambition. It demonstrated in the most tangible way possible that the earth was round and could be circled by sail. The ship became a living testament to the age of exploration, fragile wood, carrying men through an immense, dangerous, and interconnected world. To understand the significance of Victoria's voyage, we must return to the early 16th century, a time when the boundaries of the known world were rapidly expanding. The age of discovery. By the dawn of the 1500s, European powers were locked in fierce competition to explore, conquer, and trade. The Portuguese under Prince Henry the Navigator and later kings had pioneered routes along Africa, reaching the Cape of Good Hope and eventually India. Spain, not to be outdone, sponsored the voyages of Christopher Columbus, who in 1492 opened up the Americas to European eyes. The Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494, had divided the world between Spain and Portugal along an imaginary meridian. Portugal claimed the East, Africa, Asia, and the ridges of the Spice Islands, while Spain took the West, including the Americas. But the globe was larger than many realized, and uncertainty remained about where the boundaries lay. The spice trade spices were the lifeblood of this competition. Cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, and pepper were more valuable than gold, coveted for their flavor, preservative qualities, and medicinal uses. Control of the spice trade meant immense wealth. The Portuguese had established direct routes to the Moluccas, or Spice Islands, via Africa and the Indian Ocean. Spain, however, lacked access to these riches under the terms of the treaty. What if there were a western route to the Spice Islands? This question obsessed adventurers and monarchs alike. If Spain could reach Asia by sailing west, it would break Portugal's monopoly and secure untold treasures. Ferdinand Magellan. Into this rivalry stepped Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese navigator who had once served his homeland but fell out of favor with its king. Believing that the Spice Islands lay within Spain's sphere, he offered his services to King Charles I of Spain. Later, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Magellan proposed a daring plan: to sail west across the Atlantic, pass through a strait at the southern tip of the Americas, cross the unknown ocean beyond, and reach the Moluccas. It was an audacious vision, for no European had yet crossed the Pacific, and the globe's true scale remained uncertain. Charles, eager to expand Spain's influence, accepted the proposal. Preparations began for one of the most ambitious expeditions in history. At its heart were 5 ships, the Trinidad, San Antonio, Concepcion, Santiago, and the smallest of all, the Victoria. The fleet of Magellan. The expedition that would change history began not with 1 ship, but with 5. Commissioned by King Charles I of Spain, the fleet was gathered and outfitted in Seville, one of the great maritime centers of the Iberian Peninsula. The ships were modest by the standards of later centuries, but each represented the cutting edge of early 16th century naval craft. The fleet consisted of Trinidad, the flagship, commanded by Magellan himself; San Antonio, the largest of the 5, intended as a cargo ship; Concepcion, a smaller carrack, sturdy and reliable; Santiago, the smallest, often used for scouting ahead; Victoria, the vessel destined to outlast them all; All were variations of carracks and caravels, the workhorses of the age of discovery. They were not built for war, but for long voyages, blending cargo capacity with maneuverability. The shipyards of Seville. The ships were prepared in the shipyards of Seville under the supervision of experienced shipwrights. Here, in the bustling docks along the Guadalquivir River, carpenters, caulkers, and riggers worked tirelessly to ready the fleet. Oak and pine timbers formed the hulls, tar and pitch sealed the seams, and tall masts rose skyward, ready to carry the weight of canvas sails. Victoria, though the smallest at about 85 tons burden, was noted for her balance of sturdiness and agility. She was a now, a type of carrack, with high fore and aft castles that provided shelter and a commanding view, though at the cost of wind resistance. Her hull was rounded and deep, allowing for significant storage of provisions, water, and importantly, spices for the return journey. Fitting out for the voyage. Preparing ships for such an unprecedented journey required immense care. Provisions had to be loaded for a voyage that might last years. Salted meat, hardtack, beans, dried fish, olive oil, vinegar, and wine. Casks of fresh water were stowed deep in the hold, though it was understood they would spoil after months at sea. The ships were armed as well, for danger was expected not only from storms and starvation, but from hostile fleets and indigenous peoples. Each vessel carried a small number of cannons mounted on the decks, as well as crossbows, arquebuses, swords, and armor for the crew. Sailors, officers, and specialists crowded aboard. Navigators with astrolabes and compasses, pilots skilled in reading stars and coastlines, and priests to tend to the spiritual needs of the men. In total, about 270 men of varied backgrounds, Spaniards, Portuguese, Italians, Flemish, Greeks, and others, were signed on to risk their lives in the service of exploration and empire. Symbolism of the Victoria. Though no one could know her destiny at the time, Victoria would prove to be the ship most symbolic of human endurance. Her name itself, meaning victory, seemed prophetic. Where others would founder or turn back, she would carry the remnants of the expedition home, battered but triumphant, completing the first known circumnavigation of the globe. She was not built for glory. She was small, unassuming, even vulnerable compared to the great galleons of later centuries. Yet her strength lay in her simplicity, her seaworthiness, and the determination of the men who sailed her. Size and dimensions. The Victoria was not a grand ship by the standards of her time. She was classified as a nau, or carrack, a versatile design widely used in the late 15th and early 16th centuries for long-distance voyages. At roughly 85 tons burden, she was the smallest of Magellan's fleet, a fact that might have seemed a disadvantage at first, but ultimately contributed to her survival. She measured about 26 meters, 85 feet in length, and 7 meters, 23 feet, across the beam. Her draft was shallow enough to allow navigation close to coasts, but deep enough to endure the long swell of the open ocean. Her rounded hull gave her the buoyancy needed for heavy cargo, while her high stern castle and forecastle offered both shelter and a vantage point for lookouts. Rigging and sails. As a nau, Victoria carried a combination of square and lateen sails, making her adaptable to different wind conditions. On her mainmast and foremast, she bore square sails for speed before the wind. On her mizzenmast, a lateen sail allowed her to tack against the wind with some efficiency. This hybrid rig was one of the great advantages of Iberian ship design, blending the speed of northern European ships with the maneuverability of Mediterranean craft. Her total sail area was modest compared to later galleons, but sufficient to drive her steadily across the oceans at an average of 4 to 5 knots. Armament. Though primarily a merchant and exploration vessel, Victoria was armed for defense. She carried a handful of light cannons mounted on her upper decks, capable of firing iron shot at approaching vessels. Alongside these, she carried swivel guns, crossbows, arquebuses, and bladed weapons for the crew. These arms were not intended to win pitched battles against enemy fleets, but rather to deter pirates, intimidate coastal communities, and defend the ship in emergencies. In practice, it was the discipline and determination of her crew, rather than her guns, that most often ensured her safety. Crew complement. On her departure from Seville in 1519, Victoria carried about 45 to 50 men. These included officers, sailors, gunners, carpenters, a barber surgeon, and servants. The multinational character of the expedition meant that languages and customs varied, but all were united by the shared hardships of life at sea. The crew lived in cramped quarters, sleeping in hammocks or on deck. Their diet was monotonous: hardtack, dried fish, beans, salted meat, and the ever-present wine and vinegar. Fresh food was a luxury reserved for landfalls. Hygiene was minimal and disease spread quickly in the close quarters of the ship. Navigational equipment. The tools available to the Victoria's pilots reflected both the achievements and the limitations of early 16th century navigation. They carried astrolabes and quadrants to measure the altitude of the sun or stars, compasses for bearing, hourglasses to measure time and aid in dead reckoning, charts, often incomplete, sometimes more imaginative than accurate. Latitude could be determined with some reliability, but longitude remained elusive, leaving the crew dependent on experience and estimation. Each new horizon carried the possibility of discovery or disaster. Endurance and innovation. The greatest strength of the Victoria was not in her firepower or size, but in her seaworthiness. She was a balanced, durable vessel, able to endure months at sea without foundering. Her relatively small size may have even contributed to her survival, making her easier to handle with a reduced crew after years of attrition. While she carried no groundbreaking innovations in design, her voyage made her a vessel of immense symbolic importance. The Victoria proved what was possible, that a ship of ordinary construction, guided by extraordinary determination, could circle the entire world. Departure from Seville. On August 10th, 1519, the 5 ships of Magellan's fleet, including the Victoria, departed from Seville. The scene was filled with ceremony and anticipation. Priests blessed the ships, families wept as sailors waved farewell, and merchants whispered of the riches that might return. The fleet sailed down the Guadalquivir River, reaching Sanlúcar de Barrameda, and from there on September 20th, 1519, they embarked into the Atlantic Ocean. At the time, no one could know that only one ship, the modest Victoria, would ever return. The Atlantic crossing. The voyage began smoothly. The fleet crossed to the Canary Islands, where they took on supplies and repairs. Then they pushed further south, following the familiar Portuguese route toward Africa and across the Atlantic. By December, the ships reached the coast of Brazil, at a time when European knowledge of South America was still fragmentary. They sailed along the vast shoreline, seeking the passage Magellan believed existed somewhere to the south, a strait that would lead them to the ocean beyond. Trials in South America. As the fleet pressed southward, hardship mounted. They spent the harsh winter of 1520 in the desolate bays of Patagonia. Supplies dwindled and morale crumbled. Mutiny broke out among the crews, driven by hunger, fear, and resentment toward Magellan, who was Portuguese by birth and mistrusted by many of his Spanish officers. The mutiny was suppressed with ruthless severity. Leaders were executed or marooned, and order was restored. Yet the price was high. Suspicion lingered, and the men understood now that this voyage would demand everything of them. During this time, the smallest ship, the Santiago, was wrecked on the coast during a scouting mission. The fleet was reduced to 4 vessels: Trinidad, San Antonio, Concepcion, and Victoria. the Strait of Magellan. At last, in October 1520, Magellan's persistence was rewarded. The fleet discovered the narrow, twisting passage at the southern tip of the continent that would bear his name, the Strait of Magellan. The passage was treacherous. Storms, fog, and shifting currents made navigation perilous. The ships moved slowly, often separated from one another. At one point, the San Antonio deserted the expedition entirely, turning back to Spain with much-needed supplies and men. Only 3 ships emerged into the vast new ocean: Trinidad, Concepcion, and Victoria. Crossing the Pacific. What lay before them was beyond imagination. The Pacific Ocean stretched across half the globe, and its true size was unknown to Europeans. Magellan believed it could be crossed in weeks. In reality, it took more than 3 months. The crossing was a nightmare. Provisions ran out. The crew was forced to eat rats, sawdust, and even strips of leather boiled to soften them. Scurvy ravaged the men, their gums bleeding, their bodies weakening. Many died, and the survivors endured with grim determination. Through it all, the Victoria sailed steadily onward. Her small size and seaworthiness made her easier to handle with a reduced crew. She became a lifeline, carrying men and hope across the endless empty sea. At last, in March 1521, the battered ships reached the islands of Guam and then the Philippines. There, for the first time in months, the men tasted fresh food and water. Yet their relief would soon be overshadowed by tragedy. The death of Magellan. In the Philippines, Magellan became involved in local conflicts. On April 27, 1521, during the Battle of Mactan, he was killed while leading a skirmish against native warriors. His death left the expedition without its driving force. Leadership passed uncertainly among his captains, and morale wavered once more. Yet the journey had to continue. Of the 3 remaining ships, the Concepcion was later burned, as there were too few men to crew her. Now only 2 ships, Trinidad and Victoria, remained to carry the expedition's dream forward, toward the Spice Islands. Under the command of Juan Sebastian Elcano, a skilled Basque navigator, the expedition pressed on. In late 1521, the 2 ships finally reached the coveted Moluccas, the Spice Islands. Here they loaded their holds with cloves, the precious cargo that had driven the entire voyage, but disaster struck again. The Trinidad was found to be leaking badly and was unable to make the return voyage. She was eventually captured by the Portuguese. Only the Victoria, small and worn but still seaworthy, was left to attempt the impossible: the journey home across the Indian Ocean and around Africa. Alone on the open ocean. By late 1521, Victoria was the last hope of Magellan's expedition. With her hold packed full of cloves, she represented both survival and triumph. If only she could return to Spain. Under the leadership of Juan Sebastian Elcano, the small carrack prepared for the long, dangerous voyage westward. The route chosen was bold. Rather than risk capture by the Portuguese by retracing their path eastward across the Pacific, Elcano resolved to sail across the Indian Ocean and round the Cape of Good Hope. It was a course filled with hazards, storms, unfamiliar coasts, and the constant threat of hostile Portuguese patrols. Crossing the Indian Ocean. In December 1521, Victoria left the Moluccas and set her prow into the vast Indian Ocean. The months that followed were punishing. Gales battered the ship, waves towered over her small hull, and supplies again began to dwindle. The men endured hunger and sickness once more. Many succumbed to scurvy, their bodies weakened by the relentless diet of salted food and spoiled water. Some accounts describe desperate sailors gnawing on scraps of rope or leather to fill their stomachs. Yet still the ship pressed onward, driven by her sails and the determination of those who survived. The Cape of Good Hope. By May 1522, after nearly 5 months of crossing the Indian Ocean, Victoria approached the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa. Here, nature unleashed its fury. Furious winds and towering seas battered the ship. Elcano and his men struggled for weeks to round the cape, their sails torn, their hull leaking, and their bodies near exhaustion. Yet miraculously, the Victoria survived. Her small size, once considered a weakness, allowed her to ride the swells where larger ships might have foundered. She crept slowly around the cape and into the Atlantic Ocean. The final push. By now, only about 30 men remained alive, many of them skeletal and weak. Every task aboard ship, hauling ropes, repairing sails, steering the rudder, fell upon shoulders already worn thin by 3 years at sea. In July 1522, Victoria stopped briefly at the Cape Verde Islands, Portuguese territory, under the pretense of needing supplies. But when the Portuguese grew suspicious, Elcano hurriedly set sail again, fearing capture. Some crew were left behind, but the ship escaped, determined to complete her journey. Return to Spain. On September 6, 1522, after almost exactly 3 years at sea, the Victoria sailed back into Seville. Her arrival stunned all who saw her. The once proud ship was weather-beaten and battered, her sails ragged, her timbers scarred by storms and neglect. Of the nearly 270 men who had set out from Spain, only 18 survivors staggered ashore. They were greeted with awe and relief, their bodies wasted, but their spirits unbroken. They had done what no one before them had achieved. They had sailed around the entire globe. The voyage proved beyond doubt that the earth was round and could be circled by ship. It opened new horizons for trade, exploration, and empire. And at the center of it all was the small, unassuming Victoria. Recognition and legacy of Elcano. Juan Sebastian Elcano, the man who had brought Victoria home, was hailed as a hero. King Charles I granted him a coat of arms featuring a globe with the motto, Primus circumdedistimi. You first circled me. This recognition ensured Elcano's name would forever be linked with Victoria's achievement, even as Magellan, who never lived to complete the journey, remained remembered as the expedition's originator. Symbol of the Age of Discovery. When Victoria returned to Seville in September 1522, she was more than a ship. She was a symbol of possibility. Her battered hull had proved that the earth could be circled by sail, a fact that changed humanity's understanding of the world forever. She embodied the triumph of human perseverance over the unknown, a small, fragile vessel carrying her crew through 3 oceans, past storms and starvation, to achieve what had once seemed impossible. In this sense, Victoria stood as the crowning achievement of the Age of Discovery, the era when European ships first connected the globe. The fate of the Victoria. After her triumphant return, Victoria continued to serve Spain for some years, but her glory faded as new expeditions launched, better ships were built, and the spice trade developed along established routes. The original Victoria did not survive the centuries. Like many ships of her era, she was eventually lost to time, broken up or worn out through use. Yet her story lived on. The memory of her voyage became more enduring than her timbers, more lasting than the canvas of her sails. Influence on cartography and science. The circumnavigation accomplished by Victoria had profound consequences for science and cartography. For the first time, the globe had been traversed in a single, continuous voyage. Maps began to change, coastlines were redrawn with greater accuracy, and the scale of the earth was better understood. This knowledge altered trade, politics, and the imagination of the age. Empires now dreamed not only of control over coasts and islands, but of connections that spanned the entire planet. The voyage of Victoria showed that the seas were not barriers, but bridges, memory in Spain and Portugal. In Spain, Victoria became a source of pride, though her story was entwined with the tension between Magellan, the Portuguese commander, and his Spanish backers. Spanish chroniclers celebrated Juan Sebastian Elcano. who brought her home as a national hero. In Portugal, however, Magellan's name endured in another way. Though he had fallen out of favor with his king and died in the Philippines, he was still recognized as the man whose vision had made the voyage possible. Thus, Victoria's story belonged to both nations. A Spanish achievement led by a Portuguese navigator. In literature and popular culture, the story of Victoria and her circumnavigation spread rapidly through Europe. Chroniclers like Antonio Pigafetta, who sailed on the expedition, left detailed journals describing the trials, discoveries, and tragedies of the journey. His words gave posterity a vivid portrait of what life aboard had been like and ensured that the tale of Victoria would never be forgotten. Over the centuries, poets, historians, and novelists returned to her voyage as a symbol of courage and endurance. In modern times, she has appeared in history books, documentaries, and educational texts as one of the most famous ships ever to sail. Replicas and monuments to honor her achievement, replicas of the Victoria, have been constructed in recent decades. These recreations allow visitors to step aboard and imagine what it was like for those 18 survivors who finally returned to Spain in 1522. Walking her decks, one can sense the scale of the achievement, how small the ship was, and how vast the world she crossed. Monuments to Magellan, Elcano, and the Victoria stand in Spain, Portugal, and the Philippines, marking her place in global history. Museums display maps, artifacts, and models that tell her story. The name Victoria has been carried forward in ships, towns, and even space missions, a reminder that the human desire to explore never ends. Enduring legacy. Today, the Victoria is remembered not for her size or power, but for her journey. She was the first to carry human beings all the way around the planet, the first to unite the oceans in a single voyage. In doing so, she showed that the Earth was finite, interconnected, and within reach of those who dared to sail beyond the horizon. Her voyage altered commerce, science, and culture. She helped usher in the first age of globalization, when goods, ideas, and people began to move across continents and seas on an unprecedented scale. And though she no longer sails, her name endures as one of the greatest in the history of exploration. The Victoria was never the grandest of ships. She was small, lightly armed, and ordinary in her construction, one of many naus built in the shipyards of Spain. Yet it is often the ordinary that becomes extraordinary when placed in extraordinary circumstances. Her voyage was not simply a maritime achievement, but a turning point in human history. She carried with her the ambitions of kings, the rivalries of empires, the hopes of merchants, and the courage and suffering of sailors. She endured storms that nearly broke her, hunger that nearly killed her crew, mutinies, shipwrecks, and battles far from home. And still she pressed on, across oceans no European had yet traversed, until she returned to Seville as the first ship to sail completely around the globe. The Victoria proved what had long been suspected, but never before demonstrated, that the Earth was a single, unified sphere, vast but finite, and that it could be circled by human endeavor. She shrank the world in the imagination of her time, linking distant oceans and continents into one continuous story. Her legacy is more than geographical. The Victoria came to symbolize endurance in the face of impossible odds, the will to continue when hope seemed lost, and the triumph of perseverance over despair. Her name, Victory, became prophetic, not because of conquest or domination, but because she returned when all others were lost. Today, as replicas float in harbors and her tale is told in books, films, and classrooms, the Victoria endures as a reminder of the spirit of exploration. She teaches us that history is not only made by the strongest or the most powerful, but sometimes by the smallest and most fragile vessels, guided by determination and faith. And so, the memory of the Victoria sails on. She rests now only in history and imagination, but her wake circles the earth still, a line drawn across the oceans that forever change the way we see our world.